After the original Mega Man on the NES, there came Mega Man 2, a game that probably should have never existed. It did come to fruition though, and with it, Mega Man fever truly began. As popular as Cutman, Gutsman, and the Yellow Devil are, this was the game that really grabbed players and is one of the most common answers when you ask somebody what their favorite Mega Man title is. But let's cool our jets, okay? This is only Rock's second outing, we have about 100 games to cover after this, so there's no way the pinnacle of the franchise came this early, right? I'm Wes, the Explosion, and how perfect, or far from it, Mega Man 2 is what I want to talk about today. I think the story is even simpler than last time. Mega Man defeated Dr. Wily and ruined his plans, so the guy comes back with a new army and a new bid for world domination. This time, there are 8 Robot Masters, and unlike the previous 6, which were more utilitarian in design, these instead were created with combat in mind, raising the stakes. And that's all you really need to know. Surprisingly, Megs hasn't really changed much since last game. He still jumps, he still shoots. Please be patient, he'll learn some new tricks soon. Instead of the Magnet Beam though, this time Mega Man gets a series of support items, 1, 2, and 3. 1 creates a platform that floats slowly upwards for a few seconds before disappearing. 2 is a rocket sled that flies straight ahead until it hits something. 3 is a weird spider platform that climbs walls, upwards at first, but then down after you jump off, and it fades once it hits the ground. Item number 1 consumes weapon ammo every time you pop one out, and you can have up to 3 on screen at once, but the other 2 consume ammo every second they're out, and there can be only 1. You also can't pause or swap while they're on screen. All 3, in my opinion, are well designed and balanced. 1 and 3 might seem redundant since both are for vertical movement, but since 3 sticks you to the wall, you can plan your route better and don't have to worry about getting caught on a ledge, but being able to use multiple is the strong point of 1. All 3 are helpful enough, letting you cheese some stuff that's either slow going or a little bullcrap, but have reasonable enough weapon consumption that they aren't totally game breaking. Plus, they also did a really good job incorporating their use in the Wily stages. All 3 get spots where they're essential, and since you get them as a bonus for beating certain bosses, there's no chance of you missing them. It also feels like you have around as much ammo for them as you need, with maybe a bit of room for error, and spots to farm refills so that even if you mess up, the situation is never hopeless. While their basic appearance and names don't give them as much personality as some of the other support powers in later games, from a pure utility standpoint, these are some of the best in the series. And we get E-Tanks, which you can use to completely refill your health. They're not as generous as in some of the later games, letting you only hold up to 4 and you losing any you're holding if you get a game over, but hey, last game we didn't get any and these can really help out with some boss encounters, so their addition is welcome, not to mention a staple going forward. The weapons this time are really worth talking about, given how much they experimented and how many of these ideas we'd see return later. The Crash Bomb is a little hard to use in combat, you only being able to throw out one at a time and needing to wait until after it latches on and explodes to use another, but its special function of being able to explode certain barricades to either get goodies or open up alternate paths around some obstacles make me glad to have it. The Atomic Fire is a chargeable weapon and you can see what that led to, but it doesn't seem to quite work right. At least not when I use it. Sometimes it charges, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it makes the sound and flash for a full charge, but a regular shot comes out. I'm not really a fan, but there's not much I find the need to use it for, so let's call it a wash. The air shooter is fun, flying upwards and spreading out its projectiles as it does so it's good for coverage. Not only that, but this game's Big Eye, the Sniper Joe Walkers, are pretty susceptible to it. I used to hate them, with as much damage as it takes to bring them down normally, and then them leaving behind the pilot afterwards. They felt really unfair. While I'm still not a fan, a well-placed air shooter takes down at least the mech in a single shot and you can hop over the Joe afterwards, making it seem less unbalanced and more just a matter of prep. Sweet kisses to the air shooter. The bubble lead, whichever, is interesting, firing in what can barely be called an arc before quickly hitting the ground and traveling along it. This can be used on some shorter enemies the Buster can't reach, though the Metal Blade does the same, and can also sniff out invisible holes in the floor in the One Wily stage, though I tend to use the items to get around them instead, so it's really something I only bust out on the bosses that are weak to it. Quick Boomerang is one of the simpler weapons. It fires out in a small loop, but you can shoot them off pretty quick, and they have good ammo consumption, so it's good for fast damage. Leaf Shield's the basis for every other barrier weapon and the gold standard. 4 leaves spin around you, blocking most attacks, and while you can jump with it, it'll fly forward if you press a direction. It's good if you're feeling overwhelmed and need just a second to get your bearings, or if you're on a moving platform and just want to chill without having to worry about taking any cheap hits. The Time Stopper is interesting, it freezing everything but Mega Man when it's used. You can't turn it off though, and things only return back to normal once its rapidly draining energy is finally depleted, which can be a bit frustrating if you froze things in a bad position, or you just want to, I don't know, save some of it for a specific encounter maybe a bit later down the line. While this isn't the only time something like this shows up, its appearances are far and few between, compared to a lot of the other templates that show up in 2 first. And finally there's the Metal Blade. The Metal Blade, which has been hotly discussed for years, over 30 now. It can fire in 8 directions, has low ammo consumption, I think you can use it 5 times before a tick of it goes away, and half the Robot Masters are weak to it, including the guy that gives it to you. Keep that under your hat for the rematch. It's like what I said about the Magnet Beam last review, game-breaking, and because of this, some love it, some hate it. Given the overwhelming popularity of the game, more likely in the former camp, but I have seen plenty complain about it wrecking the game's balance. While there's a few enemies that does nothing to, it rips through most, and it's pretty easy to replace your Buster with the thing through most of the game. It'd probably blow my younger self's little mind, who would only use special weapons against bosses, with how much use I get out of it now. There's not really a reason not to abuse the Metal Blade, other than to challenge yourself. The reason I heard it was so busted was because games were more likely to get covered in tips and tricks magazines if it had a dumb secret like that, though I can't seem to find the quote I read back in the day to that effect. And I swear the game has enough other tricks involved that I don't really think that'd be necessary, so maybe I'm misremembering. While I think they definitely did make the weapon too overpowered, and it does make the whole weakness circle more of a tree with all its branches, it's not bad enough to make me dislike the game, and no one's forcing me to use it, so could be better, could be worse, I get both sides. The stages are great. I complained last time about how dull and generic the ones in the original Mega Man were, but here each of them stand out visually, and most fans would be able to pick out a level from just a fraction of a screenshot. Heatman's isn't just a fire level, but with its brickwork, some sort of lava sewer. Crashman's is some sort of weird tube tower that somehow reminds me of the structures in the background of Bomb Man's stage. And Flashman has some weird, cool neon block thing going on with each rectangle turning on and off. Besides just the stuff under your feet, this game does a lot with background as well. Not many just being a solid color like it was filled in with the paint bucket. The ones that really get me are the Gears in Metal Man stage and the waterfall in Bubble Man's. Each seem to use only 2 or 3 sprite sheets, constantly being cycled through, but that's enough to give the illusion of a lot more movement than what's actually present. They even fiddle around with the foreground, having clouds in Airman stage that block your vision. Everything looks great and is a big step up from the first outing. And besides the visuals, each is really well set up too. Most have gimmicks to keep you on your toes, from the slippery surfaces, water and spikes, conveyor belts, and the ones that are more simple, left to right affairs like Woodman's manage to distinguish themselves with their menagerie of enemies. Plus, while there aren't any secret screens in this one, a lot of stages have alternate paths with power-ups or ways to avoid obstacles, so experimenting and learning layouts can actually play a big part. I really like all the levels here and think each is impeccably designed. Well, all but maybe 2. The one Wily stage with the invisible holes in the floor is kind of a pain, even if you know where they're at, and getting that one E-tank is annoying, but hey, I can deal with it. The one I truly hate is something I've touched on a few times in other reviews and has been a long time coming. I despise Quickman's security lasers. At first the hazard ain't bad. The falls are pretty straight shots, and as Egoraptor has pointed out, most are shaped in a way that guide your path forward. Heck, if you're creative with iframes, you can even cheese your way to some power-ups, even if you're not quick enough to reach them normally. Then you get to the second half of the level and things get ugly. The beams shoot out way too quick so that even if you're fast enough to react to them, Mega Man is not. I do not care what anyone says, unless you have modded the game to include the slide. If you fall wrong, you cannot get around these things. The only two ways to deal with these are memorization and the time stopper. There are several screens with these things, so to remember where each platform you need to hop around is and which direction each laser is going to come from is doable, but it's a tall order. I'm sure some people who have played this game a ton have done it, though, and you know what? I respect it. For everyone else, there's the stopper, which I think is the intended method for this. First off, when you pause in this stage, the screen goes blank, outside of your menu. While you wouldn't be able to pause to let you pseudo-react, you could at least do this to plan out your route and influence your fall a bit. Second, there's weapon energy scattered throughout the section, which you'd only need if you're using the time stopper. Even with all this in mind, it's still pretty tricky, and if you screw up, you're out your ammo, so it's a pretty all-or-nothing prospect. Plus, there's walkers at the bottom, so even if you do things right, you can still fail after the fact and have to do it again without. While I suppose it's fair enough to have a hard section so that new players don't completely stump the game, at the same time, I hate parts where even skilled players are doomed to fail without the right foreknowledge. It just feels really cheap. I hate that this obstacle keeps popping up too, in Network Transmission, X5, and Pretty Anime Girl Mega Man, but this one might be the worst, due to how the workaround is implemented. First, Time Stopper doesn't turn off until you run out. There's no switching it on and off as you need it, and if you manage to get to the end with some in stock, congrats! There's a walker blocking your way, so you need to wait for it to finish so you can swap to an offensive weapon. Second, the Time Stopper is also Quickman's weakness, and he's one of the hardest bosses in the game, even with it, so you need to choose between beating the stage and beating the boss. It just feels so cruel. It wouldn't take much to make this level more palatable. Break up the sections, make the maze simpler to navigate, make the lasers slower so you can react. Have them just do a ton of damage rather than insta-death. Make the Time Stopper cancelable. Give Quickman a secondary weakness. As it stands, this is one of the only parts of the game I actively dread. The Robot Masters are once again pretty iconic. Some have interesting design choices, like Heatman being a lighter and Airman not having a proper head, and even the more traditional looking androids have little details and accessories that make them instantly recognizable, even from just the silhouette. Woodman's interesting because, had he come about in a later game, I might have said they were running out of ideas, but putting him in this early actually gives him a bit of novelty. And my favorite is Quickman, him being very reminiscent of Kashan. If you want a Mega Man anime that was made before Mega Man, that's the one. The original, at least, I think holds up pretty well. As for the actual fights, you have your standard mix of pushover, really hard, and just right. Crashman, Flashman, Metalman, Bubbleman go down quick with their weaknesses. Heatman also isn't too bad. Then you get the Notorious 3. Airman has a whole song about how hard he is, but if you have the Leaf Shield and can tank a few hits, he's easy. Heck, last run I actually beat him with just Buster, with a few ticks of health missing going in. Though admittedly, I did get lucky with his tornado placement. Why is he the focus of that song again? With Woodman, it's all about avoiding the right attack. Falling leaves don't do much damage, but his shield and him running into you do, so if you have to take an attack, make sure it comes from above and you can squeak out a win. And then there's Quickman. Dear lord is he fast and hard to predict. His weakness automatically does damage so you don't have to aim it, but it only does half, and sometimes when I'm out of practice, I still need to down a tank to keep up. And while this is common with Robot Masters, his actual attack, the quick boomerangs, do a modest amount of damage, but you take a lot more from collisions. I wish my eyes were fast enough to run into his projectiles to get iframes. My reflexes just aren't that good. Why is my hands down favorite from this game the one that drives me crazy with his stage and fight? A lot of the bosses also have oddities in their room, most commonly different floor elevations, but Bubbleman has spikes on the ceiling and Metal Man has a conveyor belt. These are removed in the rematches, making them all easier. Except for Quickman. Game, why do you do this? The bumps on the floor would sometimes trip the guy up, making him easier to deal with, but giving him a flat surface makes him a lot more erratic and harder to predict. Still, you're more likely to have the flash stopper for this encounter, so I guess there's a trade-off. The Wily stage bosses are mostly boring this time around. I love the Mecha Dragon, even if a robotic dragon isn't that creative, it still looks cool. But the Pico Pico machine are just blocks. That can sometimes get cheap damage off on you if you don't have the order it comes out of the walls in, and it happens to fly out from under where you're standing. And the Guts tank is just a bigger Guts man on treads. The Wily machine is also the same, but bigger from last game, and without the skull motif that would be included later to keep things interesting. And then there's the two that warrant more discussion. I love the Boo Beam trap, at least conceptually. You have so many targets that you need to take out with only so many shots to do so. It's a challenge that requires not skill and pattern recognition, but more traditional puzzle solving instead, which is awesome. How it actually works, though... First off, you have exactly as many crash bombs as you have things to blow up, so if you don't think through your moves carefully and screw up, you run out. So you'll just have to kinda sit there and wait to die. Second, you're being attacked every few seconds, really putting on the pressure, and the room you have to maneuver in is pretty slim, so it's hard to dodge. It's like trying to defuse a bomb while a bunch of people stand around you throwing tennis balls at your head. Third, you have to use the items to move around, so between waiting for them to peter out and your crash bombs to explode, there's a lot of waiting in this fight that brooks no dilly-dallying. And fourth, trying to pause and take stock erases all the explodable stuff from the screen, so you have to do all your planning on the fly. There's a part of me that wants to advocate for either more crash bombs to give you more wiggle room, or getting rid of the constant barrage so that you only get hit when you run out of ammo and making it an insta-kill to not drag things out, but I think the high pressure situation was what they were going for. The bomb defusal comparison might have been an apt one. And it's not all bad. If you place your bombs carefully, you can cheese things and take out 2 targets at once. Not sure if that was intentional, but I appreciate the margin of error. And if you do fail and come back in, what you destroyed will remain destroyed, so failure isn't completely hopeless. Really, if I could suggest one tweak, it would be making each of the things you have to use in the fight move a bit faster. Then there's the final boss, known simply as Alien. From just a narrative standpoint, this is awesome, making the player think that Wily was an alien invader all along. When I first got to this point, I was pretty familiar with Mega Man as a whole, so while I didn't know the exact details, I knew it was some kind of ruse. I feel gypped that I missed the twist where Wily was an alien, but then, oh no, double twist, it was a projection the whole time. That would have been mind-blowing. For the actual fight, I have a few issues. First off, I don't like enemies that can't be felled by just the standard buster. That can leave players in pretty bad positions if they run out and just have to SD upon doing so. I give it at least half a pass if it's based into the encounter and it's a gimmick like Boo Beam, and I kind of do with this fight too, since any other weapon besides the bubble lead would make it way too easy. Requiring you to get close to make your shot is what makes this fight as tricky as it is, combined with the stars flying by in the background that look similar to the boss's projectiles, so that you really need to be on your toes and plan your approach. What I take issue with is that there's no way to refill your ammo if you fail. Sure, the big long hallway that's silent other than the dripping red liquid is super ominous, and I appreciate the sense of atmosphere, but some enemies you could farm would have been better. As it stands, if you miss too many of your shots and run out of ammo, or used it all up on a previous stage, you're screwed and just have to game over to restock, losing any E-tanks you had in the process. The other thing I dislike about this fight is how long it takes. The bubbles don't do much, and watching Alien fly around really slowly in a figure 8 isn't the most interesting visually, so the boss kind of overstays its welcome. Typically, the only reason I take damage on this one is because I get impatient and go for extra hits. While I don't hate this boss, it could certainly be better. The glitches aren't too different than what I talked about with 1. Too many enemies will cause slowdown, sometimes you can despawn enemies, especially the fish that spits out shrimp, sometimes things don't load properly, and there's still that thing where you have to jump to reset your momentum on slippery surfaces. Most of them aren't as bad as in the last game though, being much less noticeable, so the game runs much more smoothly overall. There's a few unique to this one. Aside from the stuff I already touched on, the mech dragon's head has a much larger hitbox than his sprite, which kills you instantly, leading to unfair deaths. Where you can stand on the guts tank feels a little inconsistent. You can glitch through the Boo Beam's projectiles by pause spamming, and if there's too much going on, it might not take your inputs, which can be fatal if you're reaching for an E-tank. This happened to me most notably on the second part of the Wily machine, but for something in my favor, sometimes there was too much on screen for it to register me getting hit with his attacks. A lot of these seem to be Wily stage bosses, so they might have been a bit too ambitious, though none are game-breaking. Oh, and if you fall on the right side of the screen on the final stage, things are off-center until you walk back to the middle. and not sure if I'd call it a glitch, but if you grab a power-up that fills health or ammo, it cancels out any input you did while it was replenishing. More Than 2 does this. A recent playthrough just had the only time I can remember where this actually killed me, trying to jump an airman stage but a brown block saying no. Overall, a lot of improvement in this one, and all the issues are pretty negligible. Now let's talk about difficulty, and I don't mean whether the game is hard or not. Sure, some of the issues I mentioned before do make it harder than it needs to be, and some bosses get laid out way too quickly by their weaknesses, but what Mega Man title doesn't have some pushovers and some difficulty spikes? I'd say for the most part, the NES titles are pretty consistent in difficulty, being decently challenging but getting progressively easier the more you practice, which is pretty standard for that console. No, my beef is with the two options you get, normal and difficult. This is a weird complaint for me since I love choices. Easy mode makes the game more accessible, while hard is a nice addition for those that aren't satisfied with the base challenge. No, my problem is with how they're labeled. What we know as difficult is actually the regular game for the Japanese version. Normal is really an easier mode patched in for the overseas version. The main difference is that you do double damage in normal mode, so the change is pretty basic, but the mislabel feels kind of condescending. Like Westerners needed a handicap built in, and only the gods among us would be up to the task of rising to the basic level of our Japanese contemporaries. I'm probably being way too harsh. They really needed this game to succeed, so they probably just added the tweak in last minute so that the wider audience wouldn't be turned off by the difficulty. I'm just the type of person who always goes for normal, except in rare circumstances, having too much pride to do easy and not having so much to prove that I need to do hard, so I need these things labeled for me. Just call them easy and normal and I can sleep at night, though I probably am making too big of a deal out of this. Of course the soundtrack is good. I think most people who call this game overrated would agree with at least that. Not only does it give us what would become the main theme for the series in the title screen and credits, but it also has the most iconic and endlessly remixed Wily Stage 1. Even people who don't like or have forgotten Mega Man have probably heard this one. Shame it doesn't have a more memorable name. Even besides that though, the rest of the tracks are almost all great, really pushing what you could do with the NES's limited capacity. I may be biased, but I think this is one of the earliest examples, if not the first, that video game music could be more than just beeps and boops thrown in because making you play in silence would be a little awkward and perhaps unsettling, but actually good, the sort of thing you can listen to on its own, separate from the game. While it's not my favorite classic OST, it's probably my second. The only stinker I'd say this one has is the second Wily Stage track, that constantly ups its pitch before resetting itself, as if it's trying to drive you insane. So do I think Mega Man 2 is overrated? Well, yeah. It has balance issues, the metal blade makes the boss weaknesses less interesting, most of the Wily bosses are kind of boring, the following games add a lot of extra features in, and some of the difficulty spikes are a lot more noticeable than normal to me, and feel a bit obnoxious. If you asked me what the best classic game was, I'd name several entries before this, and yet, while I think a lot of people overhype it, I still think the game is really good. Unlike Mega Man 1, which needs its sequels to be relevant, I'd still play 2 whether it was the last game or the only game. It improved on the original in just about every way, to the point that you'd expect there to be a lot more titles building up to this in between, and it's what put Mega Man on the map. To illustrate what I mean, let me tell you about how this game shouldn't even exist. While the first game wasn't a disappointment per se, it didn't do well enough for Capcom to greenlight a sequel. Some of the people that worked on it though believed they really had something and got special permission to work on a follow-up, as long as they did their regular assignments. They put together a team and put together Mega Man 2 in essentially their free time. This wasn't some corporate crunch culture, but just some people working on something they were passionate about, even at the cost of their personal life, and when you have something like that fueling you, you can see some pretty miraculous results. Their payoff was a sequel with a much greater quality than the original, and the go-ahead to officially work on this series that they cared about, on company time from then on, making it one of the biggest wins in gaming history. If this game had not been as well received as it was, this likely would have been the end for Little Boy Blue, and we wouldn't have gotten any of the titles that followed. There was a time when I actually disliked this entry, but even then, I still had to appreciate it for the doors that it opened. But what about you? Is Mega Man 2 your favorite? Do you think it's overrated but still good? Or are you completely perplexed why this is the one that most people love so much? My personal top pick is still coming somewhere down the line, but for right now, thanks for watching and maybe consider subscribing if you like Mega Man content.